Can you actually get a decent work boot at Walmart that you can depend on and rely on at a more affordable Walmart price? Or are you just getting a cheap Walmart version of more popular work boots through the Walmart lens? Well, we bought 5 of their more popular work boots. We're gonna cut them in half, run through our test to really see, are they worth the price savings compared to their normal, more expensive counterparts? Are they as good as their mainstream counterparts? And do any of these make good alternatives if you can't afford anything more than the price of these boots? Because there's tons of people that work in boots for a living that can't afford these really expensive $600 work boots. All they can afford is anywhere from $30 to $100. So we're gonna figure out if you can actually trust Walmart and find out the truth of if you can even get a decent work boot. So what are the contenders of this series? Well, first we have the Aiden steel toe work shoes, 15 ounces, $35, made in China. Next up is the Brahma combustion 6-inch steel toe work boot. They weigh 1 pound, 13 ounces. They retail for $30. They're made in Vietnam. Next, we have another Brahma, the Bravo waterproof 6-inch soft toe work boots, 1 pound, 7 ounces, retail for $40, made in Vietnam as well. Next, we have the Herman Survivors. So this style is the Bison waterproof pull-on steel toe work boot. They weigh 2 pounds, retail for $75. They're made in China. And then the final contender is the Herman Survivor. The style is the Grizzly. They weigh 1 pound, 12 ounces. They retail for $65 and they're made in China. If you want any pair of these, check them out via links in the description or just run down to your local Walmart and buy a pair. This is probably the most successful and popular collaboration I've ever done. The Barefoot African Ranger, where we took one of Jim Green's most popular boots designed for African Rangers to protect South African wildlife from poachers and added a leather insole, made it zero drop by designing the Anvil outsole. And people love this boot. It was really popular and it really surprised all of us. But it was designed for South Africa, where they rarely wear really tall boots. And they mostly just wear short little boots like chukkas or the Fellies or even the African Rangers. But in the US, people like taller boots, and American boots have a very certain style about them. So I wanted to make a boot combining the best attributes of American boot making and South African techniques to make a truly unique boot on the market, because as far as I've seen, there's really no true heritage barefoot boots besides a few small shops and some boots full of synthetics. And so that's when me and Gareth and Jim Green decided to make the Barefoot African Troopers. And so that's why we spent basically this entire year up to this point going back and forth with 15 plus different prototypes to take this initial concept that, if we're being honest, is pretty ugly, to end up here at this final boot that's not just passable. I think it looks really, really good. I'm really happy with how this turned out. And it balances those barefoot attributes, those heritage attributes, and the look of American boot making. And I think it turned out so perfectly. So if you want a pair of these, they drop on June 27th, and they're gonna come in the fudge, Houston brown, Houston black. And if you want early access to beat the rush and have 4 hours a head start to the rest of the public, be sure you're on that limited edition email list, because we're gonna send you all the sizing information, everything you need to know leading up to the launch on the 27th, so you can just get that email, click the button, put your size in, and get your order in. So be sure to get on that limited edition email list below and check out the Barefoot African Troopers. So now let's start going through the details of all these to start sussing out which ones to completely avoid and which ones you might want to consider, starting with one of the most important materials and components of the shoe, or the boot, the upper, and what material they use. So starting with the Aiden first. So we did the burn test on it, and the panels on the outside are real leather. This bumper here is not real leather, and the leather is 1.15 millimeters thick. It has a little backer on the back of it, so it's really thin and really cheap suede leather. We looked at the cross section and it's just, there's no grain in there whatsoever. So it's about as cheap and thin a leather as you can put on a shoe. Next, if we look at the combustions, we put the flame to this and they just completely melted all the way around. This is a fully synthetic boot. There's no leather on this anywhere. All these panels are fake leather. They're 1.3 millimeters thick and they're foam back. And so this is probably the absolute worst material you can make a work boot out of, because it's not even the synthetic leather that has a bunch of the fibers on the inside. It's literally just foam that has a top coat of like a plastic on top. So the moment you scrape these on anything, it's immediately just gonna come apart. Like I bet, let me see. Let's just do a little on-screen test. Just from taking my little knife and just lightly scraping it on the surface, you can see it's already down to that cheap foam. So that's for sure the worst material out of all these for the upper. Next to the Bravo, so this is real leather. We burned it and it didn't melt, so it's real leather, but it is a true suede. We looked at the cross section, there's no grain in there whatsoever. It's just the loose fibers from that lower cross section of the leather cross section, where it's all just the loose fibers. There's no top smooth part of the grain of the leather that holds all those loose fibers together. That's why with suede, you can really stretch it, and I guarantee I can just pull this apart. Let's just see. Yeah. You know what I mean? Probably the worst type of leather you could put on a work boot. The next, the Bison, this is real leather. We burned it and it just acted like leather, didn't melt. We looked at the cross section, there is some grain in there, but you can tell from this kind of matte and microfiber texture to it that this is a sanded leather where they take that full cross section and sand down all the flaws and imperfections to give it this look, but also to remove any unsightly scars and bug bites or barbed wire scars. But it removes a lot of that grain, so it's not as strong as a full grain leather, but it's gonna be significantly stronger than just a cheap suede that you can literally just rip apart. It's 2 millimeters thick, so right at the bottom of that work boot leather thickness that we usually see. And it feels like a pretty decent leather. You know, it's a little bit dry feeling, but it's heavily saturated. It's got a good cross section in it. It's pretty flexible. So out of the bunch, this is probably the best leather, because if you look at the Grizzlies, this is also a nubuck leather. This is a lot more like that Timberland leather. It's clearly what they're trying to achieve with this style of boot. It's a little bit thinner at 1.7 millimeters thick, and it's backed by a non-woven material to add some additional strength and durability. But a lot of times, if you see any backing on leather, there's a good chance that they had to back it, because if it's a thick enough and high quality enough leather, you don't usually back it because it's not needed. This leather is also really dry and kind of crispy. You know, it's not the most conditioned leather, and so if you didn't touch these, this leather's going to wear out a lot faster than a type of leather that has a lot of conditioning and oil and tanning compounds worked into it to precondition it, versus a really dry, foamy leather like this. I would still take this leather over the suede because it's got the grain on it, but this is a pretty cheap dry leather. So best leather, next best, worst leather, worstest leather, and not leather. And we also ran the puncture tests with interesting results, because the Aiden did 94 pounds, but there's not enough big panels of leather to just test the leather, and so we tested the whole thing. So pretty good results, but keep that in mind. The Combustions did predictably terrible at 34. The Bravos, because it's also backed, did pretty decently at 98. The Bison did 82 pounds, and the Grizzlies surprisingly only took 65 pounds, reinforcing and backing up what we assumed as the best leather, not quite as good, and then the backers really strengthening the really cheap leathers, and then just not leather being absolute garbage. Then if we start looking at the inside of the boot or shoe with the lining materials, they're all pretty similar materials. They're basically the exact same material on all these boots for the majority of the lining, just different colors. And as for that one spot that wears out faster than any, right at the heel, where a lot of times you see higher quality work boots have a patch of either leather or a fake leather or just in a redundant piece of fabric so you don't wear through that as fast. None of these have a dedicated heel counter on the inside. And just across the board, the lining's pretty cheap and it's all synthetic. And so that is a potential fail point when they use such cheap materials for the lining, and it's also going to smell really quickly. And that's a big part of the reason why people like full leather boots, because it doesn't smell after 3 days and it doesn't wear out as fast. So none of these linings are great, to be honest. But some of them are waterproof, and so we wanted to test that too with their waterproof lining. The Aidens are not advertised as waterproof, so they're not waterproof. Same with the Combustions. The Bravos are waterproof and tested as waterproof, but something to keep in mind, this really cheap suede just acts like a sponge to all that water. So you're gonna have standing water in between the layers of the boot, your boot's gonna be heavier, and they're gonna take forever to dry. The Bisons say they're waterproof, and we tested it, they are waterproof. And the Grizzlies, I thought these were gonna be waterproof, but they're not advertised as waterproof, and obviously they don't test as waterproof. What about the insoles? Let's pull these out and see what these are about. Well, the Aiden's about as cheap of an insole as you get. It's just like packing foam. If we look at the Combustions, have a pretty decent insole, actually. It's kind of crazy. It's almost like a gel foam, and it's really perforated. And this is a comfy little insole. I was surprised by this insole for a $34 boot. If we look at the Bravos, just another cheap open cell foam. It's like a knockoff Ortholite, like a really, really cheap, crappy Ortholite. Not as good as this one. And the Bisons, kind of in between these two. It feels a little bit jelly, but not quite as nice as this one. And the Grizzlies have a very similar insole to these without the perforations, without the holes. So you're not gonna get as much breathability, but it's gonna last a little bit longer, and it's not gonna over compress like this one might. So this is probably the best insole, then this one, and then that one. But what about the steel toes? Because this is where I would be the most afraid if I was buying a really cheap boot, the steel toe and the shank that we'll go over after we cut them in half. But we want to do the steel toe test and see how they performed. And so the Aidens, we dropped it once and it performed really well, but it squished quite a bit. And I think a lot of that's due to the unstructured nature of what's underneath of the steel toe. And if we look at the Combustion, it fared a little bit better. You know, it didn't compress quite as much. Your toes are still gonna be safe on the first drop. And anytime you buy a steel toe boot and you drop something really heavy on it, you're supposed to retire it immediately. Because once you've dropped something on it really heavy once, it ruins the structural integrity of the boot. Because the next time you drop it, there's a good chance it's gonna cut your toes off. But then the Bravo, just as an example of what your toes will look like, if you don't have a steel toe and you drop something really heavy on it. This one is not steel toe, and you can see that it has just made your toes one with the really cheap insole. The Bison performed really well, passed with more than one drop, and then the Grizzlies also performed well. So really the only one I'd be concerned about is the Aiden sneaker. It was a little bit alarming, and obviously if you need a steel toe, don't get a boot without a steel toe. Then if we start looking at where the real comfort comes from these boots and what matters to a lot of people, especially in the cheap range, because cheap boots are notoriously uncomfortable, and a lot of that comfort comes from the midsole. So if we look at the Aiden, this is a 35 Shore A midsole. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but it's a foam midsole with a little rubber skin bottom. The combustion is a little bit harder foam at a 55 Shore A with this translucent, I'm guessing it's TPU, because this is clearly made to look more like an Area or a Blundstone or any of these TPU and PU style work boots that have this style outsole. And it has a really soft midsole foam like one of those boots at 35 Shore A. And it's also dual density, seemingly, with that skin on the outside and the black midsole. The Bravo is not a dual density. It seems like it's all just one density of an air infused rubber. It comes into 65 Shore A, and it just feels really, really cheap. It feels crumbly, it feels weak. It feels, we'll see when it get it cut in half and see how crumbly it is. This feels like maybe the worst midsole and outsole out of the bunch, which is unfortunate because the Bison basically has the exact same material. I think it's the same compound as 65 Shore A, and it just feels cheap. But compare that to the Grizzlies. The Grizzlies are probably the most comfortable out of the bunch because you've got a true dual density outsole, clearly modeled after the Timberland Pros, where you've got a 25 Shore A midsole for lots and lots of squish, and then a rubber outsole that's going to give you the grip. But out of the bunch, this is probably my favorite for comfort, and will probably be the most comfortable over the duration of the lifetime of the boot. As important as comfort is, durability and protection is also a really important thing. So we want to do the outsole puncture test to see how many pounds it would take to pierce through if you stood on a nail. The Aiden took 61 pounds, the Combustion 33, the Bravo 61, the Bison 61, and the Grizzly 107. But not only is the Grizzly the softest of the bunch, also the most puncture resistant. And part of that's probably due to how these are constructed, because the construction of the Aidens just look like they're cemented construction. The Combustions look like they're cemented, but the Bravos, they might be injection molded along with the Bisons and the Grizzlies. And a lot of times those injection constructions have a lot more material, they don't have as many voids, and so there's more stuff protecting you from the ground rather than just a glued on outsole. So that's all the information we know from the outside. Seems to be some trends forming here. So now let's cut them in half and really figure out which one of these you might want to avoid, which ones you should for sure avoid, and which might actually work for an affordable work boot. All right, we got them cut in half, and if you're not subscribed, consider doing it because it's the only way that we can afford to cut apart 5 brand new pairs of footwear in a single video, even if they are Walmart boots and shoes. So let's see what's inside. So now what's on the inside of all these? Well, the Aidens, you've got a full foam layer all the way through the midsole. You got a really cheap fiberboard, a really cheap pseudo shank. It looks like it's just like a piece of compressed cardboard so they could say there's a shank in there, but it's really nothing at all. I would not consider that a shank. And just a plastic counter. The combustion, you can see, is not direct injected. It's not full of foam all the way through. This is made to look like it's direct injected, like an Ariat boot or Blundstones or some of these other work boots that have dual density. Not every void is bad. If you have voids in the heel, it's pretty common, but usually you see a lot of structure above it to equally compress those chambers caused by those voids. And more importantly, it's usually made out of a lot harder and more durable material instead of a air-infused, really soft foam. And if we look at the Bravos, these ones are weird because you've got a block of wood in the heel, which is arguably better than a bunch of voids because it's lighter than rubber and it's probably cheaper, but the only other boot we've ever seen this in is like a Vietnam boot. And you can see just from cutting it how crumbly that rubber is. So that means if the rubber's acting this way when it's cut, it's gonna act that way when you're wearing them, causing this to slough off and wear prematurely because it's just a really cheap, not mixed very well, air-infused rubber that at least is filled in all the way through, unlike these ones, but it still is about as bad of a rubber as we've ever seen. Then if we look at the Bison, same exact story as the Bravos, just in a little bit more expensive a boot, and this one does have voids in it. So I was quite disappointed in this outsole. This is not gonna be the most durable outsole. It's gonna wear out pretty quick because it's just really cheap rubber and it's really soft rubber. It's made to look like it's hard rubber from the outside, but in all reality, it's just a really cheap, crumbly, air-infused rubber. Pretty terrible choice for a boot like this. Finally, one that is pretty decent on the inside. You can see that this is a true dual density. You've got some thickness on the rubber outsole. That foam goes all the way through. It's a nice, soft, squishy foam protected by that outsole. This construction doesn't seem like it's cut nearly as many corners as the other boots. And then basically across the board, all the materials used on the inside are just really cheap fiberboard, really cheap shanks. You know, it's literally just crumbling apart already, and cheap counter materials. Basically the bare minimum of what you would need to actually make this boot possible is what they used. Everything is just cheap across the board. So now we've dissected everything, tested everything, have all the results. Are any of them worth the money? Not really, because if you spent 50 bucks extra, you could get a significantly better boot from basically any brand, especially when you get these more expensive ones. You spend 25 more bucks or 50 more bucks on a pair of Ariats or any of these other reputable brands, you're gonna get twice the boot for just a little bit more money. The only one that I would even consider would be this Grizzly, because it does look comfortable, it has a lot of the features that people are looking for, but at the price that it's at, you could probably get a comparable boot from a more reputable company with better leather, better components, better lining, better construction. So just going through the list, are any of them worth it? Nope, nope, definitely no, 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 and maybe. Then what is the minimum amount to get a decent Walmart work boot? If you're actually gonna work in it and not just for a few days or a couple weeks, it seems like anything below 65, 70 bucks is just something you want to avoid. So finally, can you get a decent work boot from Walmart at all? Like if you go to Walmart and you just need a pair of work boots, well, 4 out of the 5 of these I would not buy. 3 out of the 5 I would avoid at all costs, and the only one that was half decent, it's still a big question mark. And so for me, it just kind of seems like Walmart isn't really selling work boots. Walmart is selling the appearance of work boots to the people that can't afford better work boots, and they're selling them absolute garbage, and it's gonna wear out. And the problem with that is the people that need these boots the most, that don't have the money for the better stuff, they don't have the luxury of these boots falling apart in 2 weeks and going and buying another. They're depending on these boots. And so when they take a gamble on a cheaper work boot and it fails in a few weeks, it can be really devastating for people that depend on these boots for a living. So honestly, if I was Walmart, I'd be a little bit embarrassed of my work boot offering, especially Brandon and Brahma and Grizzly and Herman Survivor. We're a work boot, we support America. Americans, well, they're just absolute garbage. I would avoid Walmart work boots because there's better alternatives. And there's gonna be some people like, well, I can't afford anything more than 30 or 40 bucks. Well, there's a lot better ways to get better work boots for around that same price. Go to a thrift store, buy some used work boots. We have a video on what to look for. A lot of times, if you look online for long enough, you can find a really discounted pair of reputable work boots for around 100 bucks, which is more in this range. And a lot of times there's programs within your company or within the state or the city that you live in, that you work in, that offer you rebates and ways to get work boots at a more affordable price. So exhausting all those before you purchase a really terrible work boot from Walmart is the way I would recommend it. So let me know what you guys think and what other work boots you want us to test and what you thought of this and any experience you have in these, what failed, what ones were surprisingly durable. And thank you guys for everything you do in supporting this channel, our Rose Anvil 2 channel, the handmade leather goods that we make here in the shop. It's the only thing that makes this possible, so thank you guys. See ya. And